Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the slow start. Trying to get some stuff downloaded that I should have downloaded at home. Yeah. So, standard check-in. So we are officially in week number 6, which is a fine place to be. So we've covered a lot of stuff. I would say we've covered the majority of like the hardcore biomechanics-y stuff. Like I've almost said like the motor control stuff, but I probably will get back to it. But we're going to take a little bit of time this week talking about just like today we're going to go through some examples of papers, like direct sort of published papers, some that I really like, so to sort of have some experience sort of going through a published article and sort of trying to make sense of that. And then on Wednesday we'll do kind of like a sort of a small group kind of assignment to help you all prepare for the sort of exam-like assignment / poster proposal 2 that will be due. Probably they'll both be kind of like connected to each other and be due at the end of, that's this week. Right. Next week. So, yeah, I got these wrong. I'll fix that later. So basically the idea is like, at this point, I've talked about some of the kind of the topic area stuff, usually in the overview, and then we spent a good amount of time recording some data in class and kind of just like eyeballing it, like looking through it and sort of trying to figure out what kind of stories could be told there. We came in with some sort of basic hypotheses and things like that. And so what I want the kind of this sort of next 2-week period to be, which next Monday is a holiday, so it'll be next 3 classes, is to prepare you all to kind of start thinking about your own chosen topic, whatever that happens to have been, using the kind of like thought processes and mental frameworks and stuff like that I've been talking about in the context of human body, human movement research based off of kinematic motion capture data. So what that's going to look like is, sort of figuring out what the topic area you've chosen is. You've already done that to some extent, but sort of just digging into that a little bit more, and then starting to think about the methodologies that are used to pursue your topic of interest. I know that sort of the way that we gathered that it was sort of a combination of talking about topics and also picking a paper, and the paper part is the sort of technically the most relevant part to the poster proposal, but I want to make sure that that's couched in the context of like, there's a reason why I like this paper, and it's because I'm interested in this topic. So trying to sort of flesh out like the methodologies involved in your area of research, the kind of like, in like the empirical sort of grounding of it, like in the sense of, so what are the methodologies used, what are the tools that are used to collect the relevant data for whatever the topic may be. And then how does that kind of map on to the kind of conversations you've been having around cameras and motion capture and sort of, what is the sort of the core empirical tool involved? What does it measure? What are the units that get derived from that? And what are the data types and structures that the sort of scientific insights in your area of focus are sort of build on top of? And that will kind of culminate into a sort of like a follow-up proposal, like proposal number 2, which will be sort of like a fleshed out version of the original sort of like, here's a paper I care about thing. So been thinking about like what kind of mechanism I want to use for that sort of thing. And I think what it will wind up being is a base level assignment that will live on Canvas and in the GitHub repo that will involve you copy pasting some text from your own kind of like the profile thing that you've been generating and pasting that into a set of chats from the bot that will be sort of prompted in the server. That will be sort of, the idea will be like you'll go in there, you'll start with whatever your last, whatever the most relevant blob of text you have about what your interests are and what the paper is that in the topic you've chosen. Take that into a chat space, and then the bot in that space will be prompted to ask you about a certain sort of layer of the stuff I've been talking about. And then at the end of that, you'll ask it for a summary, possibly using a prompt that I'll provide, and then take that and put it into another chat, and then have another sort of layer of conversation. And then the output of sort of those set of conversations will be something resembling the poster proposal 2 that will sort of be the fleshed out version of what you're looking at. And the reason for the structure is like, I thought about trying to make just like one chat like we've been doing that sort of does all the stuff, but that starts getting really difficult, and that starts getting into the space that these types of AIs sort of as implemented here just can't really do. Like they're not really, like, it's like if you give it a set of instructions, it's not really good at like 2-part instructions, like do this and then do that. Like it's just not set up for that. You can set up the code on the back end to handle some of this stuff automatically, but it's much, much easier to just like make 2 versions of the prompt and then just give you, the intelligent humans, instructions that say do this and then do that. And the idea will be kind of like, you know, you'll be setting yourself up for the next conversation, and that will also give you some sort of experience with like directed prompting and that kind of like AI-ish training thing. And like the conversations and prompts that I set up for you will be kind of built out of the lectures that I've been giving, which are on the YouTube playlist, which is linked in the server. So I'll be like, you know, doing something I've been doing. It may not be obvious to you, like of pulling the transcripts from those lectures and kind of pulling out the main points and sort of using that to help drive the conversation. And so that's why it will sort of, I'm counting that sort of set of chats as like an exam-like object where you will have a set of things to do. And if you don't do those things, you'll get a bad grade. And it will be somehow culminative and based off of stuff that has happened before, which I think is like the legal definition of a test. And then that will kind of set you up for the proposal part, which is another requirement of the structure of the class, is to make sure that by this week, we're pushing it, you're set up to actually hypothetically start working on the actual poster with the kind of fleshed out nature that that needs to be. So I will, it's the lecture pulling stuff is the reason why I'm not ready to give you anything today, but I have all that stuff. It's kind of like uploading, like the videos, they take a long time to upload, so I have to wait for the last one to get up there because I only put it up this morning. But I'll have something kind of put together and started for that by next Wednesday, so that way we can sort of talk about it a bit in class, you can ask questions, things like that, and then, you know, leading in, that would be sort of hypothetically due by the end of week 7, which is next week. And so now I'm going to give a little bit of time talking about the posters themselves, and sort of I'll put some templates into the server, and I'll get those in the relevant place on Canvas soon. But before I do that, and before you look too closely, are there any questions so far? Any sort of like concerns, stress levels, things that if you knew you would feel more comfortable about your status here? Someone sent me an email asking about the poster like structure itself, but that's what we're going to talk about today. Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, so the poster itself, these are just some examples that I found from previous courses taught, which is made more difficult because I don't have PowerPoint on this computer, but that's okay. Okay, well, only that one then. So this is a PowerPoint slide. It is, PowerPoint or Google Slides, I think, is the equivalent, or Keynote on Mac is the equivalent of that. I'm sure a lot of your lives has PowerPoint slides in it, but it's, long story short, the nice thing about something like PowerPoint is that it is a vector-based art thing, meaning that these visuals are defined not by sort of pixels on an image, like most images, like if you zoom in on them, you can start to see the pixels. Vector-based graphics are not like that. They are, because they're defined mathematically, like this curve here is not defined as a set of dots, it's defined as like a mathematical definition of how to draw this shape, and everything on the PowerPoint page is that way. So the advantage there is that you can zoom it up infinitely and you'll never see the pixels because it is not based on pixels. The opposite of vector-based is raster-based, and that's most images where if you take a screenshot and zoom in, you can only zoom in to the level of the resolution of the image. So most posters are made with a vector-based visualization method. PowerPoint is, I would say, like the entry-level version of that. PowerPoint are an equivalent of PowerPoint. And for the vast majority of you, I would say almost all of you, except for someone who has like a really specific interest in like design, I would just say use PowerPoint, use Google, whatever it is, use whatever. Just make basically a single page, a single slide that has information about your poster there. If you're feeling fancy and want to do the pro grade version of this, the professional version of a vector graphics editor is called Adobe. Adobe Illustrator is like the main one. You all have free access to the Adobe Creative Suite through your Northeastern email. You don't know how to do that, just ask someone that's not me how to get access. No? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You just download and log in, right? You just download Creative Cloud and just log in with your Northeastern account. No?
You have to go to a specific website and then go to and submit a request for a license.
Okay. Well, that's too bad. But
it takes like a day or so.
Yeah.
A day or two.
Yeah. So if you're into that, you can do it. There's also Inkscape is a free version of Adobe Illustrator, which I've used it. I've sort of in the way that these things tend to go. Like the free version has kind of been in development for a long time. When I was in grad school, it wasn't very good and wouldn't be what I would consider like a viable alternative. But I've used it recently and it's gotten pretty good. I think for basic usage, it might be helpful, but realistically, don't expect it to sort of be at the same level as Illustrator. But also, realistically, if you're new to that space, you're not going to be using the pro tools or the pro level, so you can give it a shot. And whatever you choose, I would say like the stuff that we'll be doing to prepare like the content of the poster will be independent of the poster itself. So if you want to try a fancy thing and then sort of be like, I don't want to do this, you can convert later. Okay. So what should actually go on the poster itself? Basically a poster is like a distillation of a paper. That's kind of, I think, the best way to think about it at the level that we're doing in this class. That's not all that a poster has to be. It could be other things, but the default sort of purpose of a poster is to kind of give you a representation of a particular study, typically that you, not typically, I'd say almost exclusively, that you yourself are doing, so that you can take it to something like a conference and then put it up and then stand next to it and hope people come by and talk to you about it. I showed you some pictures of like scientific conference poster sessions. You can just, sort of, that is the structure that's being sort of mimicked here. And at the end of the semester, at roughly speaking, where did I go? The week of April 7th, there will be a poster session for all the inquiries classes, and you will be assigned one of the days, and that will be your day to present, and you'll present your poster along with half of the students in each other class, And then if you're not presenting, then your assignment will be to go around and partake in the posters, including, a certain number of posters from this class and a certain number of posters from the other classes, so you can kind of like get the experience of what that sort of process looks like and feels like. Yeah. So, so like I said before, we will say again. There's the default version of the assignment, and then there's kind of the whatever else you want to do part of the assignment. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the default assignment, which is just pick a paper and present that paper as if you were, a person. I don't know if they like what the other classes say in terms of like should you be like role playing like a grad student in the lab, or should you do, I think that gets kind of weird, or you can just be like, in my paper, they blah, 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 just talk about it in the third person. But you also have the option of like, if you want to add more citations there, if you want to talk about other things. I think if you want to use any of the data that we use in this class as part of your poster, you can sort of set that up. Basically, like any of the data that you've seen before April 7th, I'll make that into a place where you can like pull screenshots and sort of just like talk about it. If you wanted to have the experience of using like actual data that you've been a part of as part of your presentation, that's a viable option. So in terms of like how do you put the poster together? How do you, from a given paper or topic area, how do you actually create a poster? That's where there is sort of like instructions about that, which I think is on this one. Yeah, there are some instructions from other classes that I'll pull up that are sort of more written setup, but the basic idea is that what you're not supposed to do is put all the information in the poster, all the information in the paper on the poster. You don't want to have what we call affectionately a wall of text poster. We all know what it feels like to be confronted with a big wall of text. It's not fun, and it doesn't really, it's not helpful to you as a person coming in. Something that I think really needs to be driven home over and over and over again is that science, the scientific process, is primarily a process of communication. If you're sitting alone in your lab collecting data and running numbers and stuff like that, and you never actually show it to anybody else, you're not actually doing science. You're just kind of like, you're doing an investigation, you're playing around with data. But the process of science is a process of communication. So when you're present in this sort of interface of a poster or a paper, is the traditional method for communicating science to other people. Presenting a poster in a conference kind of, I would say unofficially counts as a peer review type of session. You can't say this is a peer reviewed poster, but you are getting it reviewed by your peers in the sense that, other people who know the area are going to look at what you've done and hypothetically have the option of saying, oh, hey, you made a mistake here, there, or the other. Which is a cornerstone of how we do sort of science. Again, I'm talking about a system that I'm pretty jaded about, so I'll talk about it kind of in the idealized form. So when you are translating whatever poster you're doing, whatever topic you're doing, whatever project you're doing into poster form, your job is to kind of do the distillation. Like you're the person hypothetically who understands the project better than anyone else. Like if it's your research project, you probably understand the nitty-gritty of it better than anybody else in the world. And the people that you're going to be communicating with are only going to be talking to you for like a couple of minutes, like 5-10 minutes at most. Not at most, but a very short amount of time. Like if you look at the picture of like SFN or something like that, there's thousands and thousands of posters. And if you're a person, you're not going to see all of them. You're going to go to a particular area, but you're not going to be spending hours and hours on each poster. you're going to be kind of coming up and saying, hey, what's the deal here? And your job as the presenter is to be able to give them the deal, like tell them what the study was and what happened, at a level where if they just sat there quietly and listened to you, then you could get sort of from start to finish, let's say within 3 to 5 minutes, and the person listening knows enough of what's going on that they can walk away and say, oh yeah, that poster, they did this thing, they found this result, they will, if you've done a good job, they will walk away with a certain sort of gut level takeaway that they will then be able to explain what your study was about without having to know all the details itself. So there's a certain strategy on what you put on a poster where you want to make sure that you are, like, the takeaways that person walks away with should be the takeaways that you want them to walk away with. Like, there's a lot of things in a given research study, and you can present the same study in 5 different ways and sort of have the person walk away with 5 different, hopefully not incoherent, inconsistent beliefs, but you can focus on one thing or another, and you want to make sure that you're packaging it in a way that they will be able to understand, that will stick, and that they will be able to walk away. And when they say, hey, that study over there was about this person doing this thing and finding this result, that they're saying, roughly speaking, what you believe about that thing. Now, I said if that's what would happen if the person just stands there politely and doesn't say anything, which sometimes is what happens, and typically is not it's not necessarily an insult, especially at conferences, that people are tired and they just want to get the gist. But in general, in academia and the sciences, if somebody starts criticizing your work a lot and then just starts pulling it to pieces and picking up the threads, that's a compliment. Like, they care enough about what you're doing to think about it and ask questions. And it can be really off-putting to people, especially students who are used to critique being like to give you a rank order in your grade. But if I'm asking a lot of questions, it's because I want to know more, and I'm using my time and my energy and my attention to do the thing that I was trained to do as a scientist who is peer reviewing other research, which is to look for problems, look for mistakes, not necessarily to target the mistakes, but just because I want to understand what's going on, and I want to make sure that it was done right, because we're trying to sort of create new knowledge here. So that's where the second part of the strategy comes in, where if you're presenting the poster, please do not just read it to the person. That's not fun for anybody. But you're going to present it in a high-level way, and then so that when the person asks questions, ideally, you have the answer to their question right there waiting. So even though you might be just zipping through this and sort of like moving past this stuff, because it's your study, there's a certain, like, the first time you present something, you might be surprised by the questions that you get, but after the first couple of conversations, you realize that 90% of the questions that you get are predictable in some way, and so you should just have those questions sort of answerable from the data that's on the paper. So, this type of stuff is a good example where I wouldn't want to be talking about, oh yeah, we did this study with this mouse maze, and the water was this deep and the thing was this big. I don't want to be describing the size of the apparatus, but if the person asks how deep it was, I should have an answer for it. And actually, they wouldn't even have to ask that question, because they can just look at the picture and get that themselves. Similarly, with a lot of like the methods, like oftentimes that's where you put like details that you wouldn't necessarily say. You could say, oh yeah, we had this rat do this thing in this maze, but the details are there, so the person can just kind of just skim them and kind of know the answer there. And yeah, and I will say, I think that there should be some kind of a methods section, which should have some visual representation of like what you actually did, what the study actually was. Like, this is a good example because it's like, I know by looking at this that you looked at mice in a water bucket with a camera. You could just as easily have, if you skip this type of thing, oh yeah, you have this with a camera, and I know that there were 3 conditions, and one of them was a sham, meaning they didn't do anything. One is injured, and one is whatever this condition is. And so now I have a sense of like what it is that you actually did. It's really easy when you know something too well to skip the parts. I call it skipping step 0. It's like the immediate questions that anybody coming into would ask are the first things that you forget to explain when you get into it. So it's like, you could have this, if you're just showing the result, blah, 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 I could be like halfway into my conversation, but then my person asks, wait, are these mice? Are they rats? Are they fruit flies? Are they on a treadmill? Are these C. elegans? They start asking questions that make it clear. It's like, oh shit, they don't even know like the basic thing that I did, which is stand in a room with mice in a water vat. So the methods section should always have something that just makes it clear what that is. In my preference, that will typically be figure 1 in whatever paper you're looking at. This isn't always the case, but I think this is true for papers as well. Like figure 1 or something very close to figure 1 should be some kind of a picture that makes it clear what you're actually doing. And the results over here should be some representation of the data that was recorded. Typically, there's going to be, I guess, yeah, you want there to be some nice harmony here. And this is also typically where it's your job to kind of choose the most important data. For a lot of papers, and certainly for a lot of studies, you'll produce a lot of data and a lot of visualizations showing various things related to the data that you recorded. Like whatever paper you choose, like it could have 5, 6, 10 or more figures of data in it, but your job is to understand what's the main figure, what's the main result. And if I can only show 1 or 2 results from this paper, what should those results be? And those should be the results that back up the conclusions and then future directions, if that's appropriate, of the study itself. So, introduction is typically kind of like here's why we did this. This is where you can have citations if you want them. Like, we did this because it's related to this other study that did this other thing. We did this because there's this group of papers that sort of suggest that this effect is true, and so we did this study to test if that effect is true. Breaking it down into research question hypotheses is fine. Not everything has this stuff so delineated, but it's fine. Some kind of method saying here's what we did. Some kind of a data representation of like here's the main results, and then some kind of a conclusion. Because of all the stuff that we did, we believe that some fact of the world is the case. Some new proposed fact of the world is the case. Like this is typically the part where you say the things that you now believe because of the research that you did, and you hope that after going through this little journey, people that you're talking to, the people who are reading the paper, will also believe you. They'll say, yeah, the things that you're describing seem supported, they seem reasonable, I will go along with you on this. And then if enough people are convinced by the story that you've told, it becomes a quote-unquote scientific fact, which is always something to be wary of. Because we're always wrong about everything, and every scientific fact will be proven wrong in the fullness of time. But we do our best in the moment. So generally speaking, and by generally speaking, I'll say you will pretty much never read a poster to a person. Like if it's your poster, don't read it to the person. Have some other way of talking about it. But the idea is that if the person had the poster given to them and they read it from start to finish, they would know, roughly speaking, the story that you're trying to tell. And so in the poster itself, for the actual presentation, is kind of there as like it's sort of an aid for you, explaining what you're doing. So you can remember what they're talking about. You have things you can point to. You have data you can point to. But yeah, sort of it's kind of the process there. I should also say this is another sort of classic way of presenting data, where these data points up here are what we would call representative data, and then this here is some measure of the statistics of that data. So representative data is basically like you can choose, like, you, the researcher, because you are a trustworthy person who's not lying and has their methods appropriately documented, you are allowed to look at the big body of data that you have and pick a particular recording that is representative of what you're trying to show. So you might record. So in this case, they put mice in a water bucket, and then they had to learn where a platform was so they can sort of get out of the water. In our case, we were doing stuff like the jumping task or the standing task. And so for the standing, so imagine for the standing task, we recorded 25 different participants, and each of them did 10 different repetitions of data. That's 200 some odd trials or whatever. You can go in and kind of pick one trial or even one section of one trial that exemplifies the effect that you're trying to show. And then just clip out that one little part, sort of clean it up, and then paste it there and say, this is representative data from a subject in the participant study. But that's not really, without additional support, that is anecdotal. That is you just sort of picking one from a set of 1,000 options and saying, this is the one that looks like the story that I'm trying to tell. That's not really evidence on itself. So you want to be able to back that up by having some kind of a measure of statistics that is looking at all 1,000 trials that you did and sort of appropriately comparing, subjects to subjects and conditions to conditions and so that this is where you actually start having statistical power and statistically supported statements. And these are the data that kind of this is where the real grounding and sort of knowledge generation comes from. But it's good to kind of pair both because, the representative subject data helps the person kind of understand what you're talking about, or the statistical data helps them understand that this is the thing that happens in general. And that's always going to be different based on the studies and stuff that you're doing. If you want to see posters, generally if you just walk around a department in the school, you'll see posters on the wall. People put their favorite posters on the walls outside their lab. And so you can just walk around and take a look at what those look like and sort of just get a sense of the styles that are available and sort of the choices that are made. And you'll see some with a ton of words on them. You'll see some with very few words on them. And I recommend just doing that. Just go whatever hours a day you want through whatever, wherever the various departments of the school are. And you'll typically find posters on the wall that you can sort of look at. In our case, the sizes can be very different. I've gone to conferences where the posters are 6 foot by 4 foot. So very, very large. I've gone to some conferences where they're 3 feet by 3 feet, which is very small. I can't actually remember. I want to say that our posters are 24 by 36 inches, which is this big. But I can't recall. I'll look that up. That's a relevant thing to have. But mostly that will just affect the font size that you use. This is again with the vector scale stuff. The actual scale shouldn't matter too much. So, but it does depend. You want to make sure that the font size is not oppressive. Also just Google scientific poster. You'll find a lot of examples. It's the kind of thing that there will be many, many layers of explication and tutorials about how to make a good this and how to do a good that, and that will all be relevant here, with the exception that you won't be writing the paper yourself. A lot of this stuff is just going to be sort of copy pasting from the paper itself. Just get the figure, put it up, and then these sort of this section down here in the bottom right will be where you put your citations that will be generated from Zotero or whatever else. So we'll go through this, and then on a particular day of so So the poster needs to be uploaded by Tuesday, March 25th, which means that you'll upload a PDF and then it'll get printed. They charge you for it. I want to say like 20 something bucks. I can't remember exactly. I'll get that number too. But that's due at the end. What's it? Wherever the 25th is. Oh, that's due on the Monday. So 2 weeks before the actual poster session, which is mostly because, as you can imagine, the printer office gets, for this course, hundreds, I guess, of posters. So we want to make sure to give them enough lead time that they can get it all printed if in case anything goes wrong. And there'll be instructions on how to do that, and all that good stuff. Yeah. And this I will put. So I'm going to drop these into the Discord server before I put them on Canvas, just so it's available. Please load up any questions or confusions. Okay. Yeah.
So like, I choose to do my poster on one paper and I just do that one paper.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any need to have other sources? Like,
not really, no. Like by the base level assignment. So they had a couple, yeah.
That was referenced.
Sorry, say it again?
Did they only reference it in the intro?
I was looking for that because I actually can't see where these citations actually happen in the poster. I guess that might be something. I can't remember. So I would actually say this may have just been like incorrectly done because you're supposed to cite stuff here, but this, again, for this assignment, it's a little bit weird. So I'd say like the default assumption is that there's, the base level assignment is that there's only going to be one citation here, and it's the citation of the actual paper where you've got the things. I would still say you should cite it somewhere in the, in either in the introduction or in the conclusions, and say, this and that study did this, this one. Either have the one or Cho et al. 2018. Just have that cited somewhere in the text. And yeah, so in default assumption is that's just the one paper. It's also the kind of case that I think as you go into your paper, there might be some other obvious choices to cite. Like, future directions give you like, oh, there are some follow-up studies that were done after this post to be cited there. In their introduction, they might say, we're doing this because of this other paper, and then you can just cite that one too. If you wind up, they're using some weird method that you don't understand, and then you go find the review article that says, here's how that method works and how it's used. If you use that as part of your development of the poster, that's a good thing that you would want to just have some citation somewhere and then just put it down there. Citations in this context are often used as kind of like, it's a rubric. It's like, oh, you have to have this many in order for it to be a valid thing. But that's obviously nonsense. That's not how we use it in the real world. When you cite stuff that you have used to say, to understand all the work in this poster that I'm presenting and this research that I'm presenting, you have to also go back and sort of like, I am building this study and this knowledge on the basis of the stuff that I have, read before. Like I'm building this on other people's work. And if I'm doing that, I need to cite it because, if you're trying to figure out if you should trust this research that I'm presenting you, I need to tell you that the stuff I'm presenting depends on work that has come before me, and this is that work. So hypothetically, if you really, really didn't trust somebody when they're presenting their data to you, you can go back and look at all the things that they're depending on. And this is where you get into this concept. There's like a concept of like citation networks and stuff like that, where any study that has a certain number of citations, you can bounce from that study to other studies and sort of navigate all the empirical work that has been done in the world for, at least since the whatever 1800s when we started keeping track of this stuff. But for the strict assignment, it's just one thing. And in general, when it comes to posters, the citation thing is a little, it's much squishier. Like posters are, generally speaking, kind of an informal type of presentation. Not always. Some conferences are pretty serious about them, but I think for the conferences that are serious about their poster sessions, the posters are always paired with a paper. So you write a 6-page paper or whatever, a course that to go along with the poster. And the poster itself is you sort of often just sort of like, you print it for the conference and then you just use it to discuss at the conference. And then it's not going to go into some like, the annals of some scientific society or something like that. So they're generally just sort of treated as a much more informal type of thing. And then the actual proper like peer review process is done at the level of articles and papers. Make sense? Anything else? Any other questions, thoughts, feelings? Cool. All right. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, and I'll be sure to plan some time somewhere, probably somewhere in this sort of 2-week chunk. Oh yeah, do it at the beginning of this week. So I'll plan, there'll be something in this chunk to kind of like practice your poster. Actually, now I'll try to do it the week before it goes, because it's often like you put the poster together and then you start explaining it and you're like, oh, this is not at all what I want. So I will do we can do some kind of demo run probably this week, so that you'll have a chance to kind of go through it with your peers before you're doing it in person. It is also just absolutely standard experience that when you're presenting a poster for the first time, the first couple people that you present it to get the worst version of the story. And generally speaking, by the end of the session, which for a lot of conferences can be like 3-4 hours, rather long time. You have by the end of that poster session, you have the story of your research so down, like so perfectly down, that it's like, if you ever find yourself going to a conference and presenting a poster, I beg of you to do yourself the favor of taking notes, voice notes, text notes, whatever you can, about what you've been talking about in your poster, like the moment the poster session is done, because the story that you're trying to tell will never be clearer in your mind than it will be after you have told it, however many dozens of times you do. And that's another, like, within the context of like how science operates in sort of a practical communal sense, that is often the purpose of a poster session. Not always the case, but generally the case. Posters and also talks, like most of the times when you're presenting stuff at a conference, it's stuff that you're working on. It's not stuff that's you typically, I mean, it sort of depends on the cycle, but I think if you're really using the conference to its fullest extent, you should be presenting stuff that's not quite done yet. It's not ready for prime time. It's not published. It's not peer reviewed. It's the paper that you're currently writing, not the one that you just published. Because this poster session, the poster session in particular, is a really great opportunity to like hone the story that you're telling, and when and ask questions. Someone say, oh yeah, we use this method. I'm new to this, and someone's going to come by and it's like, oh, I actually know that method quite well, and then you can ask them that question when it comes up. You might have a certain way of saying it that like the first couple times you do it, people don't really get it, and then you figure out some turn of phrase that makes everyone go, oh right, yeah, now I see what's going on. And that's the way that you want to describe it. Like, when you're describing the methods, like, you'll often, this is absolutely the most classic student behavior that ever exists. You'll describe it in way too much detail. And then eventually you'll learn all the details that you can leave out that help people understand what it is with the minimum amount of time. And then that's the way you should learn how to talk about the stuff that you're doing. They're very classic, especially for grad students. Like the first time grad students start presenting research, they will spend the amount of time they spend discussing a particular area is proportional to the amount of time that they spent working on that area, and that's almost never what you should do. Like, it's possible that whoever these people are spent a good 4 to 5 months trying to figure out how to make the water in this stupid thing stop leaking out, and they kept using, there was some thing that wasn't working, and they figured out the glue, and then blah, 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 and like that's, and then when they actually got it working, the data just kind of fell out of it. And so when they give the presentation, they're going to spend the first half of the conversation talking about all the glue that they had to use and how the leak, how they sort of got the water up to the right level and da-da-da-da-da. That stuff shouldn't even be a part of the conversation. That part, sometimes when I'm giving a presentation, I'll just say, and this slide transition was 6 months of my life. And then I just show the end result where it worked and not the 15 iterations of failed attempts that I had to do before I got the version that works. If the things that you were doing to make it work are interesting, you might want to record them in another place, but a poster is almost never that time. And then that might be the case where someone comes along and they go, oh, yeah, how'd you get your stupid thing to fill up? Because ours keeps leaking. That's when you can say, oh yeah, we used this glue and not the other glue. And that's the place where, like, at the end of the paper that you wind up publishing on it, you can have the very long methods where you can have a little section about why you have to use this glue and not the other glue and da-da-da-da-da. But yeah, so it's the process of kind of distillation that I think is really the nut of this assignment. And it is your job as the sort of the ambassador of this research study to make the call, to make the judgment call about what's the most important part and what's the narrative that we're going to try to pursue here. Okay. Yeah. Right? We're good? Cool. Yeah, and we will have plenty more opportunity to talk about this stuff in your specific case, but cool. All right. Now, with all of that said, let's go and look at a paper. And let's see. So we have approximately 40 minutes left, and I am going to attempt to look at 2 separate papers, which is a terrible idea because I've already done the thing of saying this is going to have an and in the lecture. And I love the papers I'm talking about, and I'm going to want to dive deeply into them. But I think it's fun to do the quick run through. So we'll do that, and I'll try to keep myself to a particular time. I will also finish up a thought I meant to have like half an hour ago, which is after we do this sort of aside around the papers and the assignment and the exam-like object, we're going to transition into vision stuff, like eyeballs, and I'll bring in an eye tracker, and we'll sort of like talk more about visual neuroscience. I'll record some eye tracking data, sort of like go through it similar to how we did before. It's going to be a bit of a different vibe there just because of the nature of the equipment and the data, but we're going to do vision-y stuff, which is always fun. Vision and specifically eye movements, which are technically a part of motor control because it involves muscles, but sort of a interesting space there. Okay. So, in 20 minutes or less, which would put us at 4:10, I'm going to look up so routine. 15 CPG. This is one of those things I forgot for the. Storing voluntary. There we go. 2012. This used to be a new study. Now it's old. It's not that old. It's just over a decade at this point. So this is a paper published in Science, which is one of the bigger journals out there. There's two journals which are sort of like categorically the biggest journals, biggest and most prestigious, Science and Nature. That sort of cultural reality of there being a biggest thing is generally toxic and leads to a lot of bad outcomes, but nonetheless, if you see something published in Science or Nature, that's a good study, good and prestigious study. Generally speaking, the more generic the name of the journal is, the more prestigious it is. So the Portuguese study of ankle prosthetics research is generally going to be lower prestige than, Journal of Prosthetics, which is going to be lower prestige than Journal of Biology, so Science and Nature are about as big as you can get in that space. Also, Cell is a big one for biology. And because we are on campus, I could just download this here. But just for fun, we're going to go to Sci-Hub. And punch it in there. And get that way. I'm using this dark reader thing, so I'll turn that off so it looks like it would normally look. Okay, I have 15 some odd minutes to go through this. I probably won't get to the second thing. We'll see. Okay. So this is kind of normal. When you download the PDF, the front page is kind of like info about the thing. Title, artist, author list, journal, et al. Means there's more of them. And there's links here to things like supporting material, supporting online material, other things that this article cites. With modern papers, typically there's going to be supplemental data, supplemental methods, and stuff like that. Modern contemporary journal articles tend to have very, very constrained lengths. So the core studies are typically going to be quite short, unless it's like a journal review or like an older, that all varies very much by journal. So to kind of get around that, they'll often have these like supplemental stuff. So like either something like the methods will not be a part of the word count, and or you have the opportunity to present additional data there. And yeah, so what I'm going to do now with this study, because I know this study quite well, I'm going to try to give you something like a very high-level overview of this paper that ideally will both be fast enough that I can do it in the next 15 minutes, comprehensible enough that you'll be able to follow the story despite not being sort of particularly trained in this area, and ideally a sort of fair and honest representation of what was actually being done, so that if you were to take the time to sort of read this paper in depth and sort of get through all the nitty-gritty, you would come out of it saying, oh yeah, everything that Jon said about this is an accurate representation. Like, I'm creating the cartoon narrative of the study so that I can present it to you in a way that will sort of handle itself. And if you became an expert on this area and on this paper, ideally you would be able to evaluate my choices of cartoonification and understand why I am choosing this form of the cartoon and not some other form of the cartoon. So this is a study about the spinal cord. And in particular, it's looking at spinal cord injury and trying to get at something like what has been a sort of holy grail type of thing for quite some time, which is the ability to heal spinal cord injuries. Like you get you get in an accident, your spinal cord is damaged, and you lose control of your limbs below that area. You might lose control of your legs, you might lose control of your whole body, depending on where that injury occurs. And we really, really would like it if we could correct that in some way. In the same way that we can correct it when you break your ankle or damage some muscle, damage some skin, we would love to be able to correct that on a person. So this here is the abstract of the paper. Again, different journals will sort of format this in different ways. This one's not even labeling it as the abstract. They kind of assume that you know that. But sometimes it might be called a summary. Sometimes it might be called something else. I noticed that on the actual website, they're giving a sort of a high-level summary in addition to the abstract. But yeah, all the information should roughly speaking be there. So this study builds on the application is is in the space of trying to sort of heal spinal cord injury, but this study is not looking at patient populations. They're not looking at people who have spinal cord injuries. They are looking specifically at rats. And this is where, if you look at so these numbers here are the citations, and if you scroll to the end of the paper, they will correspond to the actual citations there. These are in science format. Sometimes you'll see citations where it's like author year, so it's like Matthis et al. 2019 or something like that. That's APA format. This is a more engineering style, literally just because it's made to be shorter. So if you look at these citations, they will be referencing clinical studies and medical studies and things like that, but they are not themselves doing research on humans. This is an application with a basic science sort of motivation, where they're trying to have they're trying to increase theoretical understanding, but they're doing it in service of being able to move towards this applied goal. And they are building on a history of studies of studying spinal central pattern generators in mammals. So central pattern generators exist in pretty much all animals, not necessarily all animals, but many, many animals. And they generally refer to neural architectures that generate rhythmic activation. So it's some sort of like a metronome type of activity, which is the basis of a lot of motor behavior and just general life. So let's see. So this is a really fun animation of an ant walking using alternating tripod gait. So it's the red, or one tripod, blue, another tripod. That's how insects operate, and that's a rhythmic behavior. Breathing is a rhythmic behavior. Most forms of locomotion are rhythmic behavior. Flapping is a rhythmic behavior. And it's the kind of thing that is present down to invertebrates like insects, and also present up to mammals like us. And Spinal CPG cat. And this particular study is following a particular sort of branch of ways of studying that idea of central pattern generators, specifically as they exist in the spines of invertebrates. Because it's kind of this like, there's a general question around like, we know that CPGs are present in lower animals. We can study them very carefully in those animals because they're simpler, and we can sort of open them up and sort of see these things happening. But then the question kind of arises, like, what is the role of these types of neural architectures in more complex animals like mammals who have many, many, many more neurons and have many, many, many orders of magnitude more complex behaviors, but still have the same sort of evolutionary history. So this is a video which is quite old and kind of from an era, sort of a different era of like animal rights, I'll say. So this shows a cat that has been decerebrated. So it's hard to see, but this is the cat, and it's being supported by these wires. And this cat has had its spine severed here. So from so let's see how you drop right. That. So that's the brain, and then that's the cerebellum, and that's their spine, and then these are their legs. And I think for this era, they would sever the spine there. So they surgically cut the spinal cord so that there is no information going from the legs to the brain and no information going from the brain to the legs. And so the legs are still connected to the spinal cord here. And then kind of the interesting result here is that if the cat is supported and walking on a treadmill, the hind limbs are still walking. They're still doing the rhythmic behavior of locomotion, being driven by the sensory motor loops from the feet up through the spine and sort of back. So this is kind of counter to a lot of our intuitions about how the spine works, which we tend to think of it as like a we often think of it as just kind of like extension cables that sort of lead from like the brain down to the dumb muscles. But this type of stuff shows that there is processing happening in there. Like your spinal cord is a part of your central nervous system, and it can handle simple stuff like the sensory information coming off of the feet is enough to generate the behavior that leads the feet to sort of like, if I'm being pushed backwards at a certain point, I should lift up, go forward, and come down again. And the two limbs are sort of reciprocally activated by central pattern generators in the spine. And so that not only can the cat walk, despite having no cerebral input to their spine to the back legs, as the treadmill speeds up, they speed up with it, which is just sort of, chew on that. You seem perturbed.
It just feels wrong.
Yeah. It's a wild result, just to be clear, and it absolutely is baffling in many layers and levels. But it's part of the reason why I like to study so much. And it's kind of like, as is often the case, it's those parts of the empirical investigation where you go, oh wait, that's not what I was expecting, where often the best investigations live. Because despite how strange that is, I'm giving up on the second paper. We're going to focus on this one for the rest of the class. We'll talk about the next one. The next one is about dragonflies. We'll talk about that once we've done more vision-y stuff. It's about vision and dragonflies. We'll get there. So despite that being a sort of strange and baffling study, it's also venerable. Like it's been around for a while. We've known about this for a while, that there are these central pattern generators that govern movement, and they handle like things like the basic trade-offs between the limbs going from stance to swing and stuff like that. And so there's been active areas of research since then trying to understand the nature of these spinal CPGs and trying to understand how they operate and sort of what the connection is between the brain and the upper level of the brain and the lower level of the spine and sort of into the peripheral nerves and stuff like that. And those studies have evolved. There was some point in time, I'm not really sure the exact history here, where the animal rights rules kind of evolved. And at some point they were like, don't use cats for that anymore. The rules about animal ethics are interesting and complicated. I'll talk about them at some point. But there are kind of rules about which animal you're allowed to use for which study. And there are some kind of strange designations for higher level versus lower level. And typically speaking, the closer you get to a human-like animal, the more stringent the standards are. So we do still use non-human primates for neuroscience research. We don't use apes and chimpanzees. But if you want to do monkey research, you have to really, really justify that you're doing research that needs to be done, that it needs to be done on a non-human primate. And so at some point they decided that you can't do it on cats anymore, so now they do similar stuff with rats. So this study was done with rats. And this paper also, by the way, has a really fun TED Talk about it, where Greg Lacoutin is that's a very smarmy French type of thing, which is a really good presentation. If you can get past the kind of the TED Talkiness of it all. But it's a good job of telling an interesting story. Although, yeah, the way he tells the story is actually not the way I tell my story, because that's another sort of point to call out here. I am telling you this story as I have internalized it. Me as a particular individual human scientist with a particular background and sort of area of the world that I'm trying to make sense of, when I tell you the story about this paper, it's going to be different than if the authors of the study told you this paper, or if somebody with a different background and interest set were to tell you the story of this paper. There's this sort of context of narrative that keeps coming up that feels sort of unexpected in a sort of discussion of scientific empirical studies. But remember, this is all stuff being done by humans, and we only remember stories that make sense to us. And so the story I'm going to tell you sort of highlights a particular area of this that I think is sort of I found motivating. Since I gave myself a little bit more time, I'll also talk a little bit more structurally about this paper. So these are all authors of the paper. They all contributed in some way. The person at the front is the first author. Typically speaking, this is the owner of this person who did the work and sort of owned the project. Generally speaking, this is going to be a grad student or a postdoc or something like that. The last author is oftentimes the senior author. So generally speaking, not always the case, and this is somewhat field dependent, but in most biology-related, neuroscience-y types of studies, the last author is the person who runs the lab where the study was done, and the first author is the person in the lab that generally did that work. Again, it varies dramatically by paper and by field and by whatnot. But if you're in grad school or a postdoc, something like that, you will be considering your first author publications differently from your non-first author publications. The people in the middle are typically people that helped out in some way, but they were not the owner of the study. And then once you get to once you start publishing papers and start doing things that involve paper publishing, people will ask you questions about how many first author publications you have versus second author publications. Typically, you'll have more second author pubs than first author pubs. And then once you get to the point where you actually are running a lab, people will start asking questions about how many last author publications you have, meaning, are you training people to do this work appropriately? Again, that's very field dependent. math people, when they publish math papers, they publish their authors alphabetically, which is wild to me. But what I'm describing here is like sort of like standard cultural practice in contemporary scientific publishing. Down here, you got all these little citations showing what these numbers correspond to, so like where they're working. Most of the work is done in Switzerland. And it's also going to tag, here's a tag that says, okay, so these two have a star that says these authors contributed equally to this work, which is something, it's a way that people try to get around the first authorness of it. But I guarantee you there was a discussion about, despite them being starred, who actually gets to be first. And then this one is also important. This is the corresponding author. So this little symbol here says that if you want to ask a question about this paper, you should contact this guy. So that's typically going to be in there. And also, I won't go to the end, just because, again, from a structural perspective, there's always going to be something like an acknowledgments somewhere in the paper, and they'll do like thanks, like, thank you for this person for helping with the robotic interface and da 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 da. But they will also generally, not generally, always should cite their funding sources. So where did the money come from? Like in this case, they're listing a bunch of grants from European research councils and da 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 da. This is an expensive study, so there's a bunch of grants, but it's sort of a, there's always going to be something saying thanks to the NIH for giving me this grant or whatever. And typically, this is another place where like you say, hey, thanks for giving me this grant, and you say this is grant number is this. So you can, for public grants, which most of these are, you can go look up the grant that was written to fund this research and sort of see what they were talking about there. So it's just kind of another way that people kind of keep connected to the larger community when they're publishing particular papers. Yeah. Modern papers also tend to talk, they have very more recent than 2012, it's more common to see sections that list out what each author did. So like this person helped collect the data, this person wrote the thing, and there'll be a paragraph or two saying what each author actually did when they were, like how did they earn their spot on the author list. Okay, so this particular study, this is your figure one. Figure one, this style of figure is very common in like science and nature journals, because science and nature journals are very, very short and very, very dense. This is also specifically a report, which is, generally speaking, the journal will have like, we have articles which are full length, and like report, which is short length, and brief communication, which is some other length. And it's just, so this is a report, which is like, it's not the longest format, it's the second, it's like a shorter form. And this whole study is 5 pages, including this front page. So it's only 4 written pages of text. And then probably if you go to those supplemental documents, it's going to be, when you go to the supplemental stuff, it's typically going to look like a Microsoft Word document converted to PDF, and it's going to be dozens to possibly more pages. But this study, so this picture with very dense with like lettered sort of sub panels. And in particular with this kind of like professional looking animation sort of or visualization here, very indicative of this type of journal. If you go to sort of more like standard bread and butter types of journals, like anything that's like journal of, like biomechanics journal of blank, the figures will generally look more like a real regular human made them rather than like a professional graphics design team, which in this case is what happens. So yeah, and then when I'm looking at a new paper, I will look at the title. I'll look at, roughly speaking, who wrote it, like not the people. See if I recognize any names and kind of just look at where they're working. I'll read the abstract, and then I'll kind of skim the paper and look, start out by just looking at the figures. I typically, I will pretty much never just like sit down with a new paper and just read it from start to finish like it's a novel. Like that's just not how we tend to interrogate scientific papers. Usually it's kind of like JPEG compression, like you do skims at different levels, and you kind of, because you want to have the full picture, and then you can sort of like choose to zone in to different levels of analysis, to different sort of parts of the paper. And science is a no clickbait situation, so if we're writing a good paper, the title is a summary, the abstract is a summary, and then the paper itself will have sort of repetitive summaries within it. So we're going to look at this. So this is figure 1, which will be referenced in the article somewhere, here. So that's S1. So S1 is supplemental figure. But yeah, so if they're citing figures which are not in the main article. They're in only. You have to go to the supplemental information to get the results there. But this is the first one I'm seeing. Figure 1C represents this figure, and the letter corresponds to this section here. The figure will always have a caption. The caption will always have a sort of one-sentence summary of like what we're looking at here, and then each lettered subsection will have some little write-up of what's going on in that section. So this one is kind of doing, like I said, I think that generally speaking, figure 1 should always be a methods figure, and that you should also always, or ideally, have representative data. This is doing both. This is both a methods figure, and a representation of representative data. Okay, so what were they actually doing here? So looking at spinal central pattern generators in mammals. They're looking at it in rats specifically, or they're using a rat as their model organism. They don't actually care about rats that much. But they're using rats as a proxy animal that we believe has sufficient complexity that if we learn something about how something works in a rat, that will be helpful in getting a treatment into humans. And I happen to know that if you look at what this guy's been up to recently, they have been able to apply this stuff in humans. And I think they are actually getting to the point of, I don't know about like fully healing, but I think they are restoring voluntary control of locomotion after a paralyzing spinal cord injury. So I haven't checked in on him in a couple, like 2 or 3 years, I guess. So, but he's like one of these like mega people. Like if you go to SFN, he has like several rows. That's just like a bunch of people that work in his lab because he just, he's like it's like a business owner type of thing. So it's a very, very different vibe if you have like a lab with 150 people in it versus if you have a lab like mine, which has like 3 people in it. So I don't want to run a lab like that. That sounds terrible. So the idea was, so they took the rats and they so they took the rats and they gave them a surgical spinal cord injury. They went in there and they gave them an injury that damaged their spine and severed all the fibers going to their brain. So this is a picture of the central nervous system of a rat. These are the two lobes of the brain, and then this is, I'm not going to draw it, but this is the spinal cord itself. And the idea here, this is kind of like the clever part, is, so if this is the spine, they didn't just cut straight across. They did two cuts. One, like 60% of the way through up here, and then a little bit below it, they cut it again going down there. So all of the fibers that are going through here get severed, but they're not just chopping it out. So there is still a sort of a path, hypothetically, to go through. So if it was possible for these fibers to kind of regrow and reform and reconnect to each other, then you could theoretically have a signal coming from here and sort of like bypassing these injury points and getting back up to the brain. And so the idea was that this is the process of sort of the decerebration part that's sort of similar to what they did in the cat video. And literally it just, they went in there and did surgery on these rats and went in with a little scalpel and cut them in certain areas. And I'm sure if you go, adults rat received a left lateral over hemisection at thoracic T vertebrae T7 and a right lateral hemisection at T10. It's one of those things. Like, if you knew what all those words meant, then you would be able to say, oh, okay, I understand all the details there. Over hemisection means a little over half. So they didn't go to the halfway point, they went over that. And so then what they do, and so, let's see if I can, this. So now we put the mouse rat, in this little robotic gantry system. So this is there's other studies on this particular system, but this is kind of the 2012 version of that little wire support and treadmill thing from the cat. And so basically what they were able to do is, it's like, I think this is the best picture we're going to get in here. And actually, I think, almost certainly the supplemental information for the paper has many, many things to say about this particular robotic system. But basically, it's like kind of like a 3D printer, if you've ever seen that, where it's kind of like a motor control that sort of moves over a 2D plane. And then it sort of goes down to this kind of like supportive mechanism. And it supports the mouse or the rat, with partial body weight support, so it's not floating off the ground, but it's also not holding its full body weight, and it allows it to turn and stuff like that while maintaining that body weight support. So, no matter what happens, it's detecting what's going on, and it's always making sure that the rat has 10 to 20% of its body weight on the ground, let's say. And sure enough, as we are sort of not surprised to learn, even after, so this is the activity, so they hold it upright so it walks in this kind of like bipedal way, which is sort of would be cute if it wasn't so macabre. And this is what intact means, not chopped up. So the intact animal looks, the behavior looks like this. So the trajectories in blue here are the trajectories of the feet, and this is all, and then they go here. So we are not shocked to learn that even after this injury, they can still walk decently okay. Like if you put them in the little robotic thing and drag them along, they can walk just fine. There's this complicated sort of like electrochemical thing that they put into their spine to make sure that the neurons are still sort of active and healthy and sort of firing hard enough to move the limbs. What they found with those cats is that even like the video you saw was probably right after that surgery was done. But typically what happens is the behaviors kind of extinguish over time. So like after a couple of hours or days, or I think not more than weeks, the cat would stop doing that behavior, and if you put it back on the treadmill, it would just kind of wind up dragging its feet. And so one of the results that they built on from their own lab is building this sort of combination of like a pharmaceutical cocktail and a particular electrical stimulation pattern that allows them to keep the animals like the decerebrated animals doing this movement for a sort of arbitrary amount of time. And yeah, so I think that's the setup. So we've got these rats. They've been decerebrated, and they can do this sort of walking task, and good for them. And so now here's where, and so that's all cool, but none of it is shocking. This is all stuff that we already knew when we showed the cat video. So their specific thing that they're trying to do is restore the animal's ability to initiate walking. So a lot of this stuff is kind of like they're dragging it along like on a treadmill. So it gets the stimulus that it needs. Like the feet drag and they sort of pick up, then the sensory signals pick up and they start taking steps. But the rat cannot just sit there and just decide to start walking forward. So they're trying to restore that ability to do that. And this is where there's a lot going on here in terms of methodology that there's just too much depth to get into. But I will say that they broke the animals up into two groups. One of the groups of animals was getting the control condition, I guess, which was training. So they would do this surgery to them. They would give them this electrochemical prosthetic that allows them to sort of keep walking. And then they would put them in this sort of robotic suit, and they would have them do this like movement training. So it would take a bunch of steps and a bunch of in a row. Then the other group, and this is where I think the main sort of like interesting nut of the paper comes in. The other group would do a matched amount of training, so a matched amount of steps, but before they would start the robot thing pulling them forward, they would put chocolate in front of their face. And apparently rats like chocolate. And so they would put the chocolate in front of their face, and the rat goes, oh shit, I really want the chocolate. And then the robot kind of pulls them forward, and then they do the stepping behavior, and then they get to eat the chocolate that was sort of presented to them. So now we have two matched groups of rats. One is being trained and taking a bunch of steps with this robotic gantry system. The other is doing the exact same behaviors, but they are being given a motivating food thing. Then they do the exact same steps, and then they receive the food as a reward for doing that. And in the last 2 minutes of class, if you sort of dig into all of this stuff, what happens is that the animals that only do the base training don't get better. And eventually the behavior still becomes extinguished, and they never regain that capacity. The animals that get the chocolate reward experience this kind of regrowth pattern where they, over enough time, they see these connections getting formed that sort of bypass the injury site. And over time, they can put the chocolate in front of the rat, and the rat can actually initiate the stepping behavior before the robotic gantry kind of pulls them forward. And that is, I think, really amazing. And the idea is that it taps into the kind of the way that we move our bodies in the world. It wasn't enough for the control rats to keep doing the stepping behavior because it wasn't connected to anything in the world around it. Whereas the ones with the chocolate condition, they had the experience of, oh, there's something out there in the world that I want. It's in front of me. I need to walk to get it. They start walking. They don't know that they're being dragged by a robot. And then as a result of that behavior, they get to eat the chocolate. And so when that happens, it triggers this other concept of the dopaminergic reward system, where basically the brain gets flooded with this reward chemical that's called dopamine and a bunch of other stuff that basically has the effect of reinforcing all the neurons that were just firing. Just dopaminergic reward system is kind of how that works. And so it's that connection between that sort of that frontal area, that volitional sort of prefrontal lobe cortex thing of, I wish I was over there so I could eat the chocolate, and then a bunch of neural activity happens, and then you get to eat the chocolate, and then your brain gets flooded with neurons that say, whatever was just happening, reinforce that. And then that is enough to trigger regrowth of neurons at the spinal level. And that is as much as I'm going to say about this paper and in the class. So thanks for following along, and I'll see y'all on Wednesday. I'm going to do 2 papers. Someday I'll learn. I'll never learn.